David Ignatius, a columnist at the Washington Post. It's my pleasure to moderate today's discussion of the future of deception in war, lessons from Ukraine, with two extraordinary experts who are going to help us think about this most challenging problem. First, retired Major General Mick Ryan from the Australian military is the inaugural Senior Fellow for Military Studies at the Lowy Institute and an adjunct fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Peter Warren Singer is a strategist and senior fellow at New America. They've been working on the new report. I'll show you the cover page on the future of deception and war. I've had a chance to look at it, and I invite all of those watching to get a link from the New America Foundation and to take a look at this extraordinary study. So let me begin by asking you to engage the question that's on the whole world's mind. On Sunday, in Russia, we saw an extraordinary example of surprise and the necessary accompanying deception in war in the attack by Ukraine's security service, the SBU, on 5 airfields across the breadth of Russia, striking at Russian bombers and apparently command and control planes. It was an operation said to have been in the planning for 18 months. Let me ask each of you to begin by talking about this Operation Spiderweb, as the Ukrainian SBU has dubbed it, how you think it was put together, and what you think the implications are for this war and for warfare more generally. Mick, let me ask you to begin.
Well, thanks, David. It's great to be with you and Peter today. We're very proud to launch this report and very appreciative that you take the time to moderate the discussion. I think the operation on the weekend was a very old form of warfare in many respects. It was a deep raid behind enemy lines, but it's used new forms of technologies to execute it. So what we've seen is an operation that will probably have military impacts on Russia's capacity to launch these long-range, precise, hard-to-intercept and high explosive payload weapons against Ukraine. But we also see a psychological impact on Russian leadership and the Russian people, hopefully. Whether it changes Putin's calculus, I am not sure yet. I think its biggest impact will be on the future of warfare rather than this war, by showing us new ways to hurt our adversaries at long range, using a lot of deception and clever means. And I think it will have an impact not just on the future of war and how we defend our military bases, but also how we defend critical national infrastructure as well, because democracies, I think, are even more vulnerable to this form of attack than Russia is.
Peter, how would you begin in assessing Operation Spiderweb?
So actually, I'd like to begin first by thanking you for moderating this and my partner in the writing of it, Mick, and everyone else that we've been working with. And I should also, as a point of housekeeping, ensure to state that this event was funded in part by the Russia Strategic Initiative at U.S. European Command, but that the views expressed in it do not necessarily represent the views of the Department of Defense or U.S. government, et cetera. So with that out of the way, I think, it's really fascinating because there's this quote from, it's in Proverbs 24:6, by way of deception, thou shalt do war. And it's both in the Bible, but it was the first motto of Mossad. And it's this line that runs through warfare, whether we're thinking of, the walls of Jericho to the deception campaign before D-Day, which were the week of that anniversary, to Operation Spiderweb. There's this line of using misdirection, using surprise, exploiting enemy assumptions, exploiting vulnerabilities, and doing it in a way that's designed to have some kind of strategic effect, some kind of strategic objective. And, I completely agree with Mick. It's both important to look at that operation in the context of Ukraine, but also how it might be replicated, copied, inspire other actions beyond Ukraine. And, if you think about like it brought together surprise, deception, concealment, cover, definitely exploited assumptions of that they were safe in a location that they weren't. But one of the parts that really struck me, and we kept seeing it again and again when we were looking at these other case examples in earlier parts of the Ukraine campaign, was deception only works if it's affordable and in a certain way that it has a greater effect than you invest in it. And I think that's where maybe this has sort of the biggest deal in terms of the conflict, but also the lessons that come out of it. We don't know the full cost of the Ukrainian campaign, but they're basically using quadcopters that cost in the hundreds or thousands of dollars, and they're taking out strategic bombers that the sum total is in the billions. And that's just in the attack itself. And then, as Mick notes, it's the ripple effects of it, because from this point on, Russia has to think about defending every other locale in the future, which is a huge expense. So it's like a cost imposition. That is the question it provokes back to us, not just as we wrestle with in the paper. Are we falling behind in our capabilities to detect deception, to carry out deception in war, but also how would we defend against the things that we're seeing happen right now in Ukraine?
So let me ask each of you the question that I've had people posing to me the last several days. How vulnerable is the United States to an attack like this? For example, how secure are the perimeter areas around key U.S. military bases? We read that one objective of China's Assault Typhoon and other cyber attacks has been to condition areas around military bases for possible action. What would be your judgment, each of you, about the vulnerability of the United States to what we just saw? Drones coming in from somewhere you didn't anticipate, and suddenly strategic assets are destroyed. Mick?
Well, I think it's fair to say that there has been some learning over the last 3.5 years. I think it would be unfair to say the US military and others have not learned at all from these kind of attacks. But I think we're probably very much like the Russian Air Force. We haven't learned enough. And there is a gap in learning and adaptation, just like there was in the Russian Air Force that the Ukrainians exploited. So one of the wonderful things about democracy is that we're very open. We have open telecommunications networks. We have freedom of movement, both of which would facilitate these kind of attacks. I think that the United States, Australia, and other countries are quite vulnerable to these kind of attacks. We're still thinking through not just the technological aspects, but there's a whole lot of legislative aspects in states and at the federal level for using drones and counter-drone technologies in our homelands. And we need to work our way through these legislative aspects as well as the technological aspects to be able to better defend against these attacks, not just against critical military bases, but our critical infrastructure or large national activities against which these kind of attacks by nation states or non-state actors might well be a very popular option, because as Peter says, it is a cost imposition strategy. It's a very cheap way to impose a whole lot of hurt.
Peter, could this happen to us?
The short answer is yes. The longer answer is three things. First of all, as Mick has written about, wars are really they're battles of blood, they're battles of treasure, but they're also battles of learning between the two sides. And let's be direct about this. Use of small drones in warfare to get around air defenses, that dates back to, at least by my count, 2004, if we're looking at the use by Hezbollah, using them in operations in Lebanon, Syria area. They were used against the United States forces by ISIS when we were in Mosul. They were at the end of the Afghan war being used by the Afghans. And that's just our own experience. So this is not a new technology. This is not a new stratagem. It's just a nation used it in a more effective, smarter, maybe larger scale manner. So that's the first, we've had a long time to learn. We just haven't. And this wasn't something secret. It was out in the open. As we talk about in the report, one of the biggest challenges of deception is self-deception, right? Second issue is there's a reason why, though, it hasn't happened to us and wouldn't happen in a certain context by a Russia, by a China right now. It's because we're not at war with them. If you're thinking about the risk right now, it's by a non-state actor, harder for them to pull off this kind of campaign. But now you get to the third point. So, right now we have a deterrence framework with a Russia, with a China. That's why they would not carry out that kind of attack, today against a U.S. air base in Montana or something like that. But if you move to, and that's what we're talking about here, is if there was a major conflict, yes, we're highly vulnerable to this because of the cheapening of technology and our failure to prepare for these kinds of threats, whether we're thinking about, how we defend our airfields, the new hangars for the stealth fighters and bombers, they aren't set up to defend against this kind of attack, even though we're talking about weapon systems that cost in the hundreds of millions of dollars. If we want to have a discussion about the planned spending of not tens, but hundreds of billions of dollars to create a dome of defense around the United States, how much of it would be against this kind of threat as opposed to a traditional missile-borne threat? So that's the learning that needs to happen. Stop deceiving ourselves.
Let me just follow up on one point that Peter's answer raised for me. We have all sorts of reports of drones flying near military bases, drones flying over New Jersey. Sometimes there's a sort of almost a mass psychology that seems to be at work. But I'm curious whether either of you think that we need to begin to control drone space, if you will, the part of airspace that these little quadcopters inhabit, so we have a better idea of what's there, where it's coming from, what might be threatening.
I think that would be an interesting proposition. At the end of the day, the Ukrainians talk about two types of airspace now. They talk about drone airspace and aircraft airspace. And I think we're going to have to become more sophisticated in how we understand the interaction of these two forms of airspace. We control airspace for big crewed aircraft. We may well have to do something similar for uncrewed aircraft. And this is where I think new technologies like artificial intelligence and newer forms of miniaturized radars might have to play a role here. But, there'll be issues there with surveillance state accusations and these kind of things as well.
Peter,
David, the challenge, I think, is when in the report we looked at not just the lessons from Ukraine, but how there's a series of new technologies that are changing not just war, but how people try and deceive back and forth in it. But one of the key aspects of these technologies is that they have incredibly low barriers to entry. And every one of them is used by the civilian world and going to be used more and more by the civilian world. So, if we're talking about drones, well, yes, more and more militaries are using them, but also we're starting to see them used not just for recreation, but delivery of everything from tacos to medicine, and we're only scraping the surface of that. Same thing if we're talking about AI, or another key element is 3D printing. So I don't think you could create any kind of ban on civilian use of them, unless you kind of wanted to, turn get a time machine technology. But I do think you'll have to figure out issues like chain of custody, trying to figure out, what's appropriate use versus weaponization use of it. And then are there ways of not just saying this is airspace you can't go into, but walling it off in some means that's more effective? It may be digital means. We've tried different elements towards that. And again, so it's there's no easy, ready answer to it, but I don't think trying to create a ban. And the other part is, again, and I think that example in New Jersey is a great one, is um, not to let hysteria or fears drive us into making decisions that aren't studied and wise. I mean, it was that New Jersey episode was fascinating in how it was such a big deal for about a couple of weeks, and then we stopped. And and we could have a longer conversation, but clearly there was also a lot of people having fun with the fact that other people were talking about drones.
So we talked at the outset about lessons learned in war, and war, in a sense, being a learning exercise. And I want to ask you both about uh, one asserted lesson of the Ukraine, which is that the battlefield has become transparent. General Zaluzhny, who was the commander of Ukrainian forces, when he left his command, wrote a very interesting long essay drawing some conclusions, and he seemed to be pointing in that direction with pervasive overhead surveillance, drones. Every time you stick your head up, you're visible. It's said that the only time you can escape drone surveillance is at twilight at the end of the day and in the very early morning hours when the sensors aren't so good. But let me ask you, Mick, first to take on that claim that this is a transparent battlefield. What are the ways in which that might be true, and what are the ways in which it isn't?
Well, I think certainly the battle space is far more visible than it has ever been before. The meshing of different sensors, the closing of the detection to destruction gap, as I call it, through a whole range of technologies as well as new ideas, has ensured that it is very difficult to move in the modern battlefield and not be seen. But we still do, and as we've seen from this war, the Ukrainians and Russians have managed to surprise each other on many, many occasions, including on the last weekend. But Kursk, Kharkiv, Kherson, all these things. And I served in Afghanistan, which was the most densely surveilled battle space in the history of humankind until that time. And the Taliban still managed to surprise us. So I don't think transparent is the right word, because we're not seeing the intentions into the hearts and minds of human beings, but it's certainly more visible. Uh, Whilst at the same time, we need to protect ourselves against thinking we have full visibility or full understanding or full wisdom about what's going on due to these wonderful new technologies. The enemy, as we note in our report, will continue to deceive us and surprise us, and we need to close that gap.
Peter, what thoughts do you have about transparency or lack of it?
I think we're seeing more, but the fog of war has not gone away. And in fact, technology offers new means to create a digital version of the fog of war. I think there's sometimes a confusion between saying a transparent battlefield, but what they're often really talking about is that short time cycle between when you are spotted and the kill effect, that it's because of the cycle of missile strikes, artillery fires, whatever it is, it's that once you are found, it's incredibly lethal right now. And I think we're sometimes kind of conflating those two things. But as Mick notes, and we have this opening to the report, which is it's like a parallel between the preparations before D-Day, but also the Ukrainian operations a couple of months ago. And you had a attacking force that, even though you had an enemy that's trying to find out everything about them, is able to deceive, is able to create surprise. they're just doing it in a manner that's not using, inflatable tanks and patent making appearances in other locations. They are doing certain parallels. They're doing it with false radio chatter. A new version of it is that they're camouflaging their real forces, making you think there's other forces in location. They're doing social media chatter to make you think that you're conducting an operation somewhere else. There's this wonderful little parallel. If you go back to D-Day, they drop dummy parachutists behind enemy lines that have firecrackers that go off. The Ukrainians are using drones to go behind enemy lines, drop speakers that have voices of Ukrainian soldiers talking so that the Russians think that they're behind them. So, we're seeing, yes, there's all this observation, but you can still get away with trickery, with deception. And I think, again, the most important lesson is they're feeding into, and this is one of these enduring lessons, they're feeding into the adversary's, assumptions. And that's the best way to trick someone, is not to make them think something new, is to reinforce what they already think. That idea of, what is it, Magruder's principle.
So, Mick, you're such a student of the tactical issues in warfare, and I wanted to ask you a particular question. As drones become ever more important on the battlefield, I've noticed that electronic warfare that seeks to disable and defeat drones is also advancing very rapidly. It's as if there's a drone EW race that's going on. And I'd be very interested in your evaluation of that race. And more specifically, when we think about deception, is it possible that EW, electronic warfare, will open up whole new categories for being able to hide operations and intent even from your adversary?
No, I think that's a great observation. In many respects, electronic warfare is the comeback king of this war. It is probably the capability that has had one of the greatest surges since February 2022. I think electronic warfare and drone warfare are co-evolutionary. I don't think you can talk about one without talking about the other. They are evolving together, whilst at the same time they're being used against each other on the battlefield. And whilst there are developments that see electronic warfare being more difficult because of fiber optic controlled drones, it is still very important, not just for finding drones or tracking drones, more importantly, finding the operations center. It's always better to kill the operator than the drone. But it's also important more broadly in warfare for doing things like Peter said, fake radio networks or finding the enemy's radio networks, not just for drones. So I think it's an important and enduring part of warfare. You're seeing it more delegated down to the individual level with man-portable electronic warfare systems. So I think this will be a technology that will continue to evolve. There is an electronic warfare adaptation battle, but I think the EW drone interaction is probably the most important point to make here.
Peter, I've heard four-star admirals claim that the movement of aircraft carrier task forces will be possible under an EW bubble that will make that movement much less vulnerable to anti-missile technology, anti-ship missiles than you might think. And I've never been sure whether to believe that or not. Do you have any insight into whether this purported ability to use EW to mask large movements at sea or on land, for that matter, has merit?
So there's a couple of things to say here. The first is, remember, you can use multiple means of targeting. So it might not just be radar, it could be visual data, geographic data, et cetera. And the United States, for example, we've struck in past air war campaigns against sites that had some kind of EW protection, and we found a different way to get, a JDAM to land on the target. The second is, and Mick referenced this, is EW can create this sort of bubble of jamming around you, but it's a lot like a flashlight at night. You reveal that you're there. You reveal that's your location. It's loud by definition. Now, then you get into the game of deception and war. Maybe you turn that into an advantage. And there's again a long history of this. The evening of June 5th, 1944, the Allies know they can't hide thousands of airplanes coming into Normandy, so they actually have a bomber raid a little bit further away where they're dropping the early version of EW, aluminum foil, etc. So they're basically trying to be loud in another location. What you can do now, though, with new technology that you couldn't do before is cross it with cyber. Something that you've written about as well, which is instead of trying to blind the enemy's radar defenses with jamming, you try and enter into the systems, and you would rather have the enemy radar operator not say my screen has gone fuzzy, but say tonight is like any other night, nothing happening. And that's something that, for example, the Israelis did in a past airstrike on Syria. They did a combination of EW and cyber so that the surface-to-air missile batteries weren't seeing anything as opposed to being jamming. The last couple of things that I'd add is one of the challenges, and the Ukrainians and Russians run into this all the time, EW can be just as hard on your own drones as the enemy's. There's so much fratricide of drones, and that's a big thing to figure out. But I think the end point to this is all of this leads you down a pathway of something that we said we'd never ever do in war, but now the Ukrainians and the Russians are moving towards, and we are, which is, hey, if I can't remote control my drone, I'd rather it still operate without me. And then so we see more and more autonomy, systems that are designed to operate without that line of communication, operate without access to GPS. And we're seeing that in Ukraine with everything from the flying drones to the robotic boats that have been used to strike Russian harbors, et cetera. So, again, it's this like thread through history, but we're seeing new manifestations of it with new technology.
It's a fascinating discussion, and I'm sure valuable for the audience as for me. And it's a good segue to talking about AI and the ways in which AI will affect both the ability to deceive and the ability to detect deception. And I'd like to ask you to speak about each. I'll just note, Mick, before you start, I was thinking, if you'd had an AI system in Germany on June 5th and the morning of June 6th, let's just say June 5th, would that AI system have been able to see that there was a fake out going on or not? But anyway, take that wherever it is. Talk to us about AI and deception.
Well, I think one of the potential applications of AI, and I'm sure there are some who are already doing this, is that you can sift through vast sums of data over time from very many different forms of sensors, from the eyeball to satellite to ground listening stations and everything in between. But you can sift through it all, but you have to understand what you're seeing. I mean, you have to have the right prompts for AI. You have to ensure that the analysis is going to the right people in the right form, because ultimately AI is about helping humans make better decisions. AI is not making the decisions. So it's about the clever programming, the clever prompting, and the clever application of what emerges from it that may well have helped German commanders on the night of the 5th of June and every night beforehand and afterwards. I think AI will play an increasing role in the use of drone warfare, but also in deception. One, just understanding the adversary's thinking, their inclinations, their locations and capabilities, and then it will help our own planning. It's being used in military headquarters now in a lot of planning activities to speed up planning, to enhance wargaming and options development, and help senior leaders make decisions about deception and many, many other things as well. So, AI, we're really not even at the tippy top of the iceberg in its application for drones, deception, and helping humans make better decisions.
Peter, let me turn to you on this question of AI and deception. Maybe you could engage the question of what I would call grand strategic deception, making your adversary think things about your society, where it's going, the stresses or lack of them, that would have a fundamental impact on any conflict.
Wow. I think there's a couple things that kick in related to AI. There's, on one hand, as Mick notes, you through this technology can gain access to and conduct an analysis of orders and orders and orders of magnitude more data points of a wide variety of different kind, and come to insights and make connections that you wouldn't have before, find the needle in the haystack that you wouldn't have before. And we see this in whether it's military applications to trying to find cancer. The flip side of that is it allows micro-targeting. It may allow more effective information warfare campaigns, not just conducted on a nation as a whole, but on individual leaders to understand exactly what do they believe, what's their pressure points. It's basically the equivalent of what you're already seeing in the algorithm on the ads on the side, be it on Twitter or Instagram or whatever. This is what someone like you is going to be influenced by. And we'll see military versions of that. We already seen some of that in Ukraine, where you're going after individual officers and or leaders by gaining insights into them. But what I'm fascinated by is sort of the downside of all of this, maybe the overpromise of AI that we looked at too. AI, yes, it gives you more capability, but also it can be deceived in new and different ways, in particular, going after the sensor data that it's pulling in. So if you know it's going to react to one thing, you feed it that kind of information. And, we're starting to see examples of that. Another challenge with AI is it self-deceives. It's repeatedly overconfident. The terminology sometimes called hallucinates. In many ways, I think of AI as like a over-eager intern. It knows a lot, but it doesn't know what it doesn't know. And so that can get it into trouble and you into trouble with it. And that leads to the third and final, the overselling of AI. Much of the discourse of it related to civilian life, but also warfare, is aligned with bluntly people that are trying to sell you AI. So I'm not against it. There's huge, huge value. It's going to be utilized, but we also have to be aware of there are certain ways that it's not capable or that it's breakable. And back to your macro geopolitical thing, a bit of a concern is that overconfidence level is not just, I'm not just talking about the United States. It's the same thing in potential adversaries. The PLA has literally, it's in the midst of reorienting its entire way of thinking, its way of planning to fight future wars, from being hoping to be information dominant to it roughly translates as intelligization, which is essentially handing off not just tactical but strategic level thinking to machine intelligence.
We're going to come to the Pacific theater and the implications of discussion in 1 minute, but I want to just ask if you think about an extension of the AI deception puzzle, and that's um, the space warfare aspect of conflict. One thought I've had is that Ukraine, in some ways, is the first space war because space assets have been so important, obviously, for command and control of Ukraine's forces. Starlink has been essential as providing the communications node. The Russians know that. They've done all sorts of things to try to deal with that problem. They've made threats about taking out low Earth orbit satellites. They seem to have developed a missile and nuclear capability in space that could render space unusable for many of the assets that are there now. So in this world where space is so vulnerable and each system in space is potentially vulnerable to deception, subtle manipulation, insertion of malware is the most obvious example. What do each of you think about if I can put the two together, deception and space? Mick?
I think it's extraordinarily important because space-based sensors are very important for enhancing our visibility of not just the surface of the Earth, but a whole lot of other spectra as well. So it enhances our visibility, but that also means there's wider potential for deceiving what these sensors are seeing. In White Sun War, a novel I wrote about the war in Ukraine, I talked about deceiving weather satellites because it was a way that you can change enemies' perceptions about what's happening and therefore force them to change what they might be doing. So I think space-based capability offers up a whole new area for deception as well as counter-deception operations. Clearly, you want to use space-based capabilities to hide your abilities whilst divining what the enemy is capable of, but where the enemy might be trying to deceive you and work your way through that. So space is vital. It is moving very quickly. Commander of the Space Force early this year testified about how the Chinese have been seen dogfighting in space. So protection of our space-based capability is another part of it in protecting our ability to communicate, to see things and to navigate. And it is probably far more important now than it's ever been before.
Peter, any thoughts about deception and space?
I'd add three things. The first is, there was the famous sales line from the movie Alien that in space no one hears you scream. There's the parallel for warfare. The opening shots of the next war will be silent. And because they're most likely taking place in space, but also they may be taking place before the conflict even started. Right. And that's that parallel between space and cyber warfare. You talked about the malware side of it. And that's the second is that we've seen in Ukraine this back and forth, right? We've seen the incredible utility of space-based assets for communication, command and control of all of these different drones that you're using for deception, counter deception. You're using it for targeting. But the war actually started with an attempt to take down satellite communications for the Ukrainians, not with a missile, but with a cyber attack. And the goal was to take advantage of the dependence on space, to have this kind of paralyzing effect by I'm pulling that out from you. And that's definitely a conceivable a scenario for any future fight that we were in. But then the third part of it is this really interesting aspect. I talked earlier about the lower barrier to entry of all of these technologies. Well, as you referenced, many of these technologies, these assets are owned by someone other than the two warring states. So it's Starlink satellites, or look at what's playing out in the Middle East. The Houthis are conducting long-range missile and drone strikes. And to go back to your question about targeting U.S. Navy ships, the Houthis don't have a space program. They don't have satellites. But at least according to US government claims, they have been able to purchase targeting information from a Chinese company that's in that sort of, it's both state and a non-state actor. It's a private company. It's a competitor of Starlink, but it's also aligned with the Chinese government. But the point is, we've got a non-state actor using civilian assets to find Navy ships and fire missiles at them. Okay, wow, that just got complicated in your response to it. In the same way, if we look at Ukraine, the Russians would certainly love to not have the Ukrainians having access to Starlink or any other space-based assets, but to go after them creates a lot more issues there.
Just would note before we turn to the Pacific Theater, my own favorite example of deception in space. There is a report that you can find on the internet, so it must be true, that the Chinese have some geocentric orbit satellites way out there in space. And as happens, when those satellites reach the end of their useful life, they get kicked into what's called the graveyard zone, which is way out in space. And it's said, I've seen what purports to be some evidence of this, that one of these Chinese satellites out in the graveyard zone came back to life and then moved back toward geocentric orbit to surveil or do other things, so that it was kind of a zombie satellite, seemingly dead but really alive. So anyway, that's probably more for a novelist than a serious analyst.
I'd be scared there, David. You were going to use a different example of when you said the best example of deception in space. I thought you were going to say the moon landing or something like that, and we'd have to end the event.
Not quite ready for that. So let me, gentlemen, ask you now to turn to a key issue, and that is the implications of this war, this learning experience in Ukraine that you've analyzed so well in your study, for the possible future conflict that we all fear may lie ahead in Asia, between China and the United States, perhaps triggered by a Chinese attempt to take over Taiwan. Talk about the ways in which each of you see the role of deception in this long-run, very dangerous strategic engagement between the U.S. and China. Mick?
Yeah, well, the war in Ukraine started as an adaptation battle between Ukraine and Russia, but it is now metastasized as a global adaptation war, where Russia is sharing insights with its authoritarian buddies in Iran, North Korea, and China. And among the insights are around how Ukraine has sought to deceive it and these kind of lessons. I think when you shift lessons from Ukraine to the Pacific, you need a series of translation filters because it's a very different theatre. It's obviously a much bigger one. The geography is different. The proportion of green to blue is very different. The alliance and non-alliance structures are very different. And frankly, the enemy in the Pacific is very different. It's much bigger, it's much more technologically advanced, and it learns better than the Russians do. And the other thing to point out about the political setting in the Pacific is, one, there's no NATO, and two, Russia, China, and North Korea are all in the Pacific. So we're not just dealing with one potential adversary there, we're dealing with three. So when it comes to deception, the size of the Pacific alone creates enormous diversity of options when it comes to opportunities to deceive each other. And if you have a look at the Pacific War, some of the amazing operations, which just are not examined very much, from deception operations to invade the Kurils during the Marianas campaign, to the Australians putting companies on islands and making them look like brigades. There are an enormous array of opportunities to deceive each other, and therefore potentially miscalculate in a future war or the lead up to a future war. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. in translating the lessons from Ukraine broadly, but also about deception, so they're applicable to allied forces in the Pacific, so we understand how the Chinese, North Koreans, and Russians might seek to deceive us, and ensure that because of their deception, we are not miscalculating.
Peter, thoughts?
So as Mick notes, there's this very clear, not just weapons exchange between China and people exchange, literally conscripts from North Korea and Russia, but there's also a learning exchange. They're sharing ideas. And so you take that and then you add in the fact that while it's a cliche of cultural thinking that somehow Sun Tzu informs everything that China does, it is factual that deception, what's described as cognitive warfare, is embedded within contemporary PLA doctrine. And so you take that aspect, number one, adversaries that have an emphasis on deception, campaign at the tactical level, at the strategic level, that are sharing insights and lessons on it. You take the second thing that we found, that there is a series of new technologies. We break them down into 6 that are reshaping what's possible to do in deception and you have to defend against. And you take the third factor, these new trends, and again, we break them down into 6. We've talked about several of them, changes on the battlefield. And so you take those 3 factors and then it asks the question, are we ready? If you've got great change in technology, great change in battlefield trends, and potential adversaries that are learning and exchanging, are we ready? And the fear that we write about is that while we were once the masters of deception, as the D-Day anniversary reminds us, there appears to be we call it a deception gap growing, where it's great change, but we're not keeping a pace. And even, and we went and read it. If you go read the doctrine, the field manuals of different militaries, while they talk about the importance of deception, in too many of them, it's like a bumper sticker. It says, really, really important, but then there's not a lot of detail on, okay, here's how we would execute it, or here's what's going on contemporary. Or you think about changes in our acquisition system, training system. That's the worry for us, is that I think the final line of the report says it all, is quote, we should not deceive ourselves into thinking that we are ready for the deception campaigns of the future.
So we have a number of interesting questions from members of the audience, and I want to turn to several of those in the time that we have left. Dr. Michael Ruland, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, asked about what Peter was just talking about, the deception gap between authoritarian states and Western military institutions. Just to ask you, Peter, if you could say a bit more about whether you think that gap can be closed, and if you were to list a couple things to do to close it, what would they be?
So I definitely think it can be closed. The most important is to have that rapid learning and adoption cycle for ourselves. Picking up what is the new art of the possible for us, for our adversaries, because of these new technologies. Also taking the trends that are playing out there that have been evidenced in Ukraine and weaving them into our training, our professional military education, our acquisition systems. I mean, and it's everything from updating your doctrine to, we talk about the new things that 3D printing can do. Can we be ready to do that in terms of making decoys? A similar example of there's been all of this emphasis on purchasing. Are we purchasing enough 155 millimeter rounds for the next conflict? Are we purchasing enough decoys to make the enemy waste their weapons on false targets rather than real targets? So it's a whole series of, some are at a large level and some are just very discrete activities. it can be done. And then the other aspect, and we were talking about this before, is to recognize that authoritarians are, they're not 10 foot tall. And there are certain things that they are particularly vulnerable to. And, one is we talk about the lessons of Jones' lemma. There's more forms of information, it's harder to see, but when there's tightly controlled forms of information, easier to deceive. That describes authoritarian states, and so you can lean into that.
So we have a question here from an anonymous viewer, and Mick, why don't I direct this initially to you, and if Peter has something to add, please. So the question is, do you expect more involvement from non-state actors, e.g. anonymous or hacktivists, or we could go down the list of groups, in creating and spreading deception, and how can we deal with that?
Yeah, I think we've already seen that play out over the last few years in the war in Ukraine. We've seen on both sides hacktivists, interest groups, societal groups participate in this conflict in a way that hasn't been possible before, whether it's NAFO, who combat Russian misinformation, there's Russian equivalents. Anonymous has been around for a while. The same kind of people who brought us WikiLeaks and stuff, they've been around for a while. We'll continue to see them play out. But I think what we've seen in this war, because of the internet, social media, and a few other trends, an increasing surface area of contact between societies. You see crowdfunding to buy weapons. You see Brave One and Come Back Alive in Ukraine and their equivalents in Russia. So larger proportions of societies are now potentially in conflict during war than what we've seen. It's not just soldiers going off to fight anymore. Societies at home have the means to directly interact with enemy societies and play a role in that conflict. I don't know we've really thought through all the implications of that, not just the legal implications, but what are the impacts on societal cohesion and political leadership of that new trend in warfare.
Peter, any thoughts about this omnipresent, universally available ability to deceive?
Yeah, I think there's two elements to it. The first is you have more of these eyes watching, which has created this whole universe of open source intelligence, trackers, networks, et cetera. And they're publicizing what they find that often has military relevance. And in turn, militaries are learning from them, or even, taking that data point and confirming it themselves and making use of it. Ukraine has even created an app for people to share what they're finding online with them. And they report that they're receiving about 10,000 different items of information of some kind that can be potentially actionable, all the way to I might carry a drone strike on that target that you helped me find. The flip side of this is they definitely help with the swirl of confusion, misinformation, disinformation that creates that digital fog of not just war, but politics and culture and life right now. Pretty much any incident, think about, be it a pandemic, think about being a hacking of a gas line like Colonial Pipeline, think about being a terrorist attack, a bombing, whatever it is. Yes, there's often real-time information, but then there's this huge swirl of basically people spreading falsehood, some of them deliberately, some of them doing it deliberately for political reasons, some of it doing just for giggles. And in turn, unfortunately, you have a lot of serious people all the way up to national leaders believing them.
That's a chilling and all too visible problem. So here's another question from an anonymous viewer. Is deceiving AI or machine learning models different than deceiving humans? Is there an exploitable gap there, maybe in eroding trust between humans and machine learning decision agents? Complicated question. Mick, does that prompt any thoughts?
I guess the immediate response is there's actually not much difference. AI is reliant on how you train it and the data you give it. Humans, to make decisions, are reliant on the data that they receive. Although humans also have cultural biases, biases around gender, experience, and a whole range of other things that AI don't always have. So there is a slight difference there. But, I think both humans and AI can be deceived, depending on the data that you provided. But I think humans at the moment are still far more sophisticated than AI, and will take more effort to deceive in many respects than more and increasingly sophisticated AI models. Ultimately, for both humans and AI, you want to think about, well, what's the objective of deception? And it doesn't matter whether it's AI or humans. You need to have what's the end goal in mind if you're going to undertake a deception campaign against humans, AI, or humans and AI working together.
Peter, any thoughts about that?
Yeah, Mick got to mention his great book, White Sun War, earlier, so I'm going to do a plug for a project that August Cole and I did called Burn In. It's a useful fiction looking at AI and robotics, and not to ruin the story, but one of the themes of it was this question of the human-machine partnership, whether we're thinking about war, we're thinking about medicine, whatever, depends on this idea of trust. And trust, though, has two meanings. There's the way you and I emotionally think of trust. I trust you. I have confidence in you. And then there's the way that machines or engineers think of trust, which is, does my model of the world match the reality of the world? And so if you're thinking about deception operations, they that are trying to target humans and AI, they would go after that trust relationship, but they may be in two different ways. So think about the idea of one may be hacking, we'll use the example of hacking GPS. So the machine's model of the world doesn't match the reality of the world. It thinks it's in a different location than where it is. That causes a deception effect. But then there's the long-term emotional effect or political effect of that, which is if one machine, the GPS, is taken down or gives you wrong information, not only are you less willing to trust that machine next time, everyone across the system that heard about it is not going to blindly trust that machine, even if this was an isolated time, even if the problem's been fixed. And so it's a great question for sort of unveiling how everything with the human-machine relationship goes back to the strange, wonderful ways that humans and machines operate, but also how they come together.
So that's a superb, really intellectually challenging conclusion to our conversation. We're at the top of the hour. I want to remind the audience that they can get a copy of the new report that Mick and Peter have been talking about, the future of deception and war, lessons from Ukraine, from New America. I want to thank both of them and New America for sponsoring this really most interesting and provocative discussion, and to all of you for joining us.
Thank you.